They were laughing downstairs, celebrating. I could hear the bottles clinking, the roar of applause, the sound of my brother being worshipped for something he didn't earn. And me? I sat alone on the second floor of the house I built with my own two hands, invisible as always. I never thought it would end like this. But then again, I never thought my own family would look me in the eye and tell me I didn't belong in my own home. My name is Ashley Bennett, and this is the story of how I lost everything, and then took it all back. I was sitting in my room that evening, the one with the chipped paint on the doorframe and the window that never quite closed all the way. Below me, the house was alive with noise. Brandon's celebration party was in full swing. My younger brother had just closed what my parents were calling $1 million deal. The golden child had struck gold again, or so they wanted everyone to believe. I knew better. I had seen the paperwork he left scattered on the kitchen table last week. Brandon hadn't built anything. He had inherited the shell of a bankrupt company, rebranded it with a new name, and sold it to investors who didn't know any better. But details didn't matter in this house. Only appearances did. And Brandon had always been better at looking successful than actually being successful. The laughter grew louder. I heard my mother's voice, syrupy, sweet, and performative, calling up the stairs. "Ashley, come down here, sweetheart. Celebrate with your brother. Our Brandon just made another fortune." I closed my laptop where I had been reviewing my own business accounts. My small consulting firm had just landed its third major client this quarter, but no one downstairs would ask about that. They never did. I walked down the creaking wooden staircase of our Boston home, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was a beautiful old brownstone in a neighborhood that had gentrified over the past decade. Large windows, original hardwood floors, crown molding that spoke of old money and older values. My grandfather had bought it decades ago. My parents had lived in it ever since, raising Brandon and me within these walls that held more secrets than memories. When I entered the living room, I saw Brandon standing next to our father, David, who had his arm around my brother's shoulders. They were both grinning, faces flushed with wine and pride. My mother, Sarah, was pouring champagne for a small crowd of relatives and neighbors who had been summoned to witness Brandon's latest triumph. No one looked up when I entered. I was used to that. I moved to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. From there, I had a clear view of the celebration. My aunt was asking Brandon about his business strategy. He was explaining, with grand gestures, how he had identified an opportunity in the market. I bit my tongue. The only opportunity he had identified was a company desperate enough to sell for pennies on the dollar, which he then flipped for a modest profit that my parents had inflated into a fortune for the sake of tonight's audience. I couldn't help myself. The words slipped out before I could stop them. "So Brandon," I said, my voice cutting through the chatter, "how does it feel to inherit someone else's bankruptcy and call it a business plan?" The room went silent. Every head turned toward me. Brandon's smile faltered for just a second before hardening into something cold. My father's eyes narrowed. My mother's face went pale, then red. Brandon recovered first. His voice was smooth, practiced. "Jealousy doesn't suit you, Ashley. Or maybe you're just upset because you're not the one being celebrated tonight?" I set my water glass down carefully, keeping my voice level. "I'm not jealous of false success, Brandon. I'm just disappointed that everyone in this room is pretending not to see through it." That was the wrong thing to say. I knew it the moment the words left my mouth. My father straightened, his jaw tightening. My mother rushed forward, placing herself between Brandon and me as if I were the threat. "Ashley," she hissed. "Not here. Not now. You're embarrassing yourself." I looked around the room. No one met my eyes. They had all chosen their side long ago. I nodded slowly, set down my glass, and walked back upstairs without another word. Behind me, I heard my mother's bright, brittle laugh as she tried to smooth over the awkwardness. "My daughter is just tired," she explained to the room. "She works so hard, you know. Sometimes she forgets to be happy for others." I closed my bedroom door and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. I had been living in this house for 25 years. I had contributed more to its upkeep than anyone. When my parents couldn't make the mortgage 3 years ago, I had paid it. When the roof needed repairs, I had covered it. When Brandon needed seed money for his first failed business, I had given it, never asking for it back. And still, I was the outsider. Still, I was the one who needed to learn her place. I didn't know it then, but that night was just the beginning. The real blow was still coming. After the guests left and the house fell quiet, my parents called me downstairs. It was late, nearly midnight. The television was on in the living room, playing the evening news on mute. My father sat in his leather recliner, the one he had claimed as his throne years ago. My mother perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap like a teacher about to deliver bad news to a student. I stood in the doorway, waiting. I knew this posture. This was the position they took when they needed something from me. Money, usually, or a favor that would require me to set aside my own plans. "Ashley," my mother began, her voice taking on that sweet, reasonable tone she used when she wanted to manipulate me into compliance. We need to talk about your living situation. My living situation. I lived here. I had always lived here. This was my home as much as it was theirs. More, considering how much I had invested in keeping it standing. Brandon's girlfriend is moving in, my mother continued. They need space. A real space, not just a guest room. I felt my stomach drop. I looked at my father, but he was studying the television screen as if it held the secrets of the universe. What are you saying? I asked carefully. We're saying it's time for you to move out, my mother replied, as casually as if she were asking me to pass the salt. You're 25, Ashley. You should be independent by now. You can stay with friends while you look for your own place. The room tilted. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. You want me to leave? So Brandon can have my room? It's not about taking your room, my father said, finally looking at me. His voice was gruff, defensive. It's about what makes sense for the family. Brandon and his girlfriend need privacy. You're old enough to be on your own. I laughed. It came out harsh and bitter, a sound I didn't recognize as my own. After everything I've done for this house? For this family? You're kicking me out for Brandon? My mother's face hardened. You're being dramatic, Ashley. We're not kicking you out. We're helping you grow up. You've been too dependent on us for too long. The irony was suffocating. I had been supporting them. I had been the one paying bills, covering expenses, bailing out Brandon every time his grand plans collapsed. And now I was too dependent? I opened my mouth to argue, to list every sacrifice I had made, every dollar I had spent, every time I had put their needs before my own. But I saw it in their eyes. They had already decided. This wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict. Brandon appeared at the top of the stairs, leaning against the railing with a smirk on his face. Come on, Ashley, he called down. You've always talked about wanting your own place. We're just giving you the push you needed. You should thank us. I looked up at him, at his self-satisfied expression, and something inside me broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet, clean snap, like a thread that had been pulled too tight for too long. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked back upstairs, each step deliberate and heavy. Behind me, I heard my mother sigh with relief, as if my silence meant acceptance. In my room, I looked around at the space I had called mine for so long, the walls I had painted myself when I was 16, the bookshelf I had built from scratch, the window seat where I used to read on rainy afternoons, the photographs pinned to the corkboard above my desk, moments from a life I thought mattered to the people in this house. I pulled my old suitcase from the closet and began packing. I didn't take much. Clothes, laptop, a few books, the essentials. I left most of my belongings behind, including the framed photographs and the decorations that had made this room feel like mine. Let them throw it all away. Let them erase me as easily as they had dismissed me. The only thing I made sure to take was a small photograph of my grandfather, Henry. He had passed away when I was 10, but I remembered him clearly. He had been the only one who saw me, really saw me, in this family. He used to tell me I was stronger than I knew, that someday I would understand my worth. I had never understood what he meant until now. I zipped up the suitcase and pulled it to the door. It was nearly 2 a.m. The house was dark and silent. I crept down the stairs, careful not to wake anyone. Not because I cared about disturbing them, but because I couldn't bear the thought of another confrontation. As I reached the front door, I heard a sound behind me. I turned to see my mother standing in the hallway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable in the shadows. She didn't say anything. She just watched me leave, as if I were a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. I opened the door and stepped out into the October night. The air was cold, biting. The streetlights cast long yellow shadows across the old brick sidewalks of our Boston neighborhood. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking, dragging my suitcase behind me. I didn't look back. If I had, I might have seen my mother close the door. I might have heard the lock click into place. But I kept my eyes forward, focused on the path ahead, even though I had no idea where I was going. I had only one person I could call at this hour, Lena Martinez, my best friend since college. She lived in a small apartment above a bakery in the North End, in one of those old buildings with slanted floors and exposed brick walls. It was cramped and drafty, but it was hers, and she had always told me I was welcome anytime. I texted her as I walked. "Can I crash at your place? It's an emergency," she replied within seconds. Doors unlocked. "Come up." 20 minutes later, I was climbing the narrow stairs to her third-floor apartment. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery below filled the stairwell, warm and comforting. Lena was waiting in the doorway, wearing an oversized sweater and pajama pants, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. I didn't cry. I was too numb for tears. I just stood there, letting her hold me, feeling the weight of the night settle into my bones. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "They kicked me out," I said. My voice sounded flat, distant. "They need my room for Brandon and his girlfriend." Lena pulled back, her eyes flashing with anger. Are you kidding me? After everything you've done for them? I shrugged. Apparently, I'm too dependent. They're helping me grow up. Lena swore under her breath, a string of Spanish curses that would have made her grandmother proud. She grabbed my suitcase and pulled me inside. You're staying here as long as you need. I don't care if it's a week or a year. I managed a weak smile. Thanks, but I'll figure something out. I always do. I know you will, Lena said, guiding me to the couch. But tonight, you don't have to. Tonight, you just need to breathe. I sat down and finally let myself feel it. The exhaustion, the betrayal, the bone-deep weariness of being invisible to the people who were supposed to love me most. Lena made tea and sat beside me, not saying anything, just being there. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel completely alone. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Lena moving around the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the small windows, casting golden rectangles across the worn wooden floor. I sat up on the couch, disoriented for a moment before remembering where I was and why. Lena appeared with 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me one and sat down in the armchair across from me. Sleep okay? She asked. As well as I could, I replied, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. We sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping our coffee. Then Lena stood and walked to the window that overlooked the street. She froze, her mug halfway to her lips. Ashley? She said slowly. There's a car outside your parents' house. I set down my coffee and joined her at the window. From here, we had a clear view across the street and down the block. I could just make out my parents' brownstone in the distance. And parked in front of it was a sleek black Lincoln, the kind with tinted windows and a driver in a suit. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that car. I had only seen it a handful of times in my life, but I would recognize it anywhere. It was my grandfather's car. Not Henry, my father's father, who had passed away. This was Edward, my mother's father, the man who had cut ties with my parents years ago over some family dispute I had never fully understood. What is he doing here? Lena whispered. I don't know, I said, but I couldn't look away. The driver's side door opened, and a tall man in his 70s stepped out. Edward Bennett stood with the aid of a silver-tipped cane, but there was nothing frail about him. He carried himself with the bearing of someone who had commanded rooms and boardrooms for decades. His white hair was neatly combed, his suit impeccable. Even from this distance, I could see the sharpness in his eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of determination and barely contained fury. He walked up to my parents' front door and knocked. Not a polite tap, but a firm, authoritative knock that demanded attention. After a moment, my father appeared at the door in his bathrobe, his hair disheveled. I saw his mouth fall open in shock. Edward, he stammered. What are you doing here? Where's Ashley? My grandfather's voice carried across the quiet morning street, sharp and commanding. My mother appeared behind my father, pulling her robe tight. Dad, she said, trying to sound calm. This is unexpected. Is something wrong? Wrong? Edward's voice rose. You tell me, Sarah. I heard some very interesting news yesterday. Something about my granddaughter being thrown out of her own home. My father straightened, trying to muster some authority. With all due respect, this is our house. How we manage our family is our business. Your house? Edward repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. His cane struck the ground once, twice, the sound echoing like a gavel. That's where you're wrong, David. Brandon appeared behind our parents, his face wary. Morning, Grandpa, he said tentatively. Edward's gaze swung to him. Don't. I'm not here for pleasantries. I'm here to correct a serious misunderstanding. Lena grabbed my arm. Ashley, what is he talking about? I shook my head, my heart pounding. I have no idea. Edward reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. He handed it to a man who had emerged from the passenger side of the car. I recognized him as Michael, Edward's longtime driver and assistant. Michael opened the envelope and withdrew a sheaf of documents. I think it's time we discuss the true ownership of this property, Edward said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Because it seems you've all forgotten where this house came from. My mother's face went pale. Dad, she whispered. You can't be serious. Oh. I'm very serious, Edward replied. 20 years ago, when you and David were drowning in debt, you came to me begging for help. I gave you a loan, a substantial loan, but it came with conditions. Conditions you seem to have forgotten. What conditions? My father asked, but his voice had lost its strength. This property remains in my name, Edward said clearly, and each word felt like a hammer blow, until such time as your children are old enough to manage it responsibly. It was meant to be their inheritance, not yours to dispense as you saw fit. The street seemed to hold its breath. Even the morning birds went quiet. And according to the trust I established, Edward continued, the sole beneficiary of this property is Ashley Bennett. Lena gasped beside me. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking. Below, My mother's coffee mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the front steps, coffee spreading like a dark stain across the concrete. "That's not possible," she whispered. Edward pulled another document from Michael's hands and held it up. "This is the deed to the Bennett property. Signed, notarized, and legally binding. Ashley is the rightful owner of this house." "She always has been." My father took a step back, his face ashen. "You can't do this, Edward. She's irresponsible. She doesn't know how to manage money. Enough." Edward's cane struck the ground with such force that the sound cracked through the morning air. "You've used her kindness as an excuse for your own greed long enough. This ends now," Brandon tried to interject. "Grandpa, this isn't fair. We didn't know." "You didn't know?" Edward turned on him, and even from across the street, I could see the fury in his eyes. "You didn't know that your sister has been supporting this household? That she's paid your parents' debts? That she's funded your failed ventures? No, you knew. You just didn't care." Lena was shaking my shoulder. "Ashley, did you know about any of this?" I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No, I had no idea." Edward looked directly at our house, and for a moment, I swore he could see me standing in Lena's window. He raised his cane slightly, as if in salute. Then he turned back to my parents. "I've had enough of watching you people drain my granddaughter dry. This house belongs to her, legally, officially, and permanently. You've been living in her property, and it's time she decides what happens next." My mother tried one more time. "Please, Dad, we're family. We were just trying to help Brandon start his life." "By destroying Ashley's?" Edward shook his head. "No, you were trying to play favorites with someone else's property. But those days are over." He nodded to Michael, who handed my father a copy of the legal documents. "These are the ownership papers," Edward said. "I've already filed them with the county. The house is in Ashley's name. If you want to stay here, you'll need to ask her permission. And given how you've treated her, I wouldn't hold my breath." He turned to walk back to his car, then paused. "One more thing. Tell Ashley to come home. Her real home. It's time she took her rightful place." My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Come outside, sweetheart. It's time you came home." "Grandpa." I stood frozen, my mind racing. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my place in it, had just been turned upside down. The house I had been kicked out of, the house I had poured my money and my heart into, was mine. It had always been mine. Lena was staring at me with wide eyes. "Ashley, do you realize what this means?" I nodded slowly, a strange calm settling over me. "It means everything just changed." I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Lena called after me. "Wait, are you sure you're ready for this?" I looked back at her and smiled. For the first time in years, it felt genuine. Ready or not, it's happening. I've spent my whole life being ready for everyone else. It's time I was ready for myself. The walk down the stairs felt different. Each step was lighter. By the time I pushed open the door to the street, the October morning felt less cold and more crisp, full of possibility rather than bitterness. Edward was standing beside his car, leaning on his cane, watching my parents' house with satisfaction. When he saw me approaching, his stern expression softened into something warmer. "There she is," he said quietly. I stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure. "Grandpa," I began, but he held up a hand. "Before you say anything," he said, "I want you to know I should have done this years ago. I knew what they were doing to you. I knew, and I waited too long to act. For that, I'm sorry." I shook my head. "Why didn't you tell me? About the house? About the trust?" "Because I wanted to believe they would do the right thing," he admitted. "I thought if I gave them time, they would see your worth. But they only saw what they could take. So here we are." Across the street, my family stood frozen on the front steps. They were watching us. I could feel their eyes on me, confused and angry and afraid. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Edward said, his voice firm. "You decide. The house is yours. The decision is yours. You can evict them, you can let them stay, you can sell it and walk away. Whatever you choose, I'll support you." I looked at the house, at the brick facade and the white trimmed windows, at the place that had been my prison and my home all at once. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to earn a place in it, trying to prove I belonged, and now I learned I had owned it all along. A strange sense of calm washed over me. I turned back to Edward. "I want to go inside," I said. "I want to look them in the eye and tell them exactly what I think of what they've done." Edward smiled, pride gleaming in his eyes. "That's my girl. Come on then. Let's go show them who really owns that house." We crossed the street together, Edward's cane tapping a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. As we approached, my father tried to straighten his posture, tried to summon whatever authority he thought he still had. "Edward," he began, "we need to talk about this reasonably." "We're past reason," Edward said flatly. "Your daughter owns this house. If you want to discuss anything, discuss it with her." All eyes turned to me. I stood there, looking at the people who had raised me, who had used me, who had thrown me away when I was no longer convenient, and for the first time in my life, I felt powerful. "I want to come inside," I said quietly. "We need to talk." My mother opened her mouth to protest, but Edward's sharp look silenced her. My father stepped aside, gesturing weakly toward the open door. "After you," he said, his voice hollow. I walked through the doorway, and it felt different. The house hadn't changed, but I had. These walls, this floor, this air, it was all mine. I didn't need permission to be here. I had never needed permission. The living room was exactly as I remembered from 2 nights ago. The same furniture, the same photos on the walls. Except someone had taken down my graduation photo and replaced it with a picture of Brandon and his girlfriend. I stared at it for a moment, then walked over and lifted it off the hook. Without a word, I set it face down on the side table. My mother gasped. "Ashley, what are you doing?" "Taking back what's mine," I replied calmly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small photo of Grandfather Henry, the one I had packed in my suitcase. I hung it in the empty spot on the wall, centering it carefully. Brandon stepped forward, his face flushed. "You can't just come in here and start rearranging things." "Actually, I can," I said, turning to face him. "This is my house, Brandon. Mine. And if anyone should leave, it's you." The room fell silent. Edward stood in the doorway, a slight smile on his face. My parents looked at each other, panic beginning to set in. "Ashley," my father said, trying to sound authoritative, "let's not be hasty. This is still your family. We can work this out." "Work what out?" I asked. "The fact that you threw me out of my own house? The fact that you've been taking my money for years while treating me like I was worthless? The fact that you chose Brandon over me at every single turn?" My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "We just wanted to help your brother." "At my expense," I finished. "Always at my expense." I turned to Edward. "Thank you for telling me the truth, for giving me what was rightfully mine, but I need to decide what to do with it." "Take your time," Edward said, "but remember, you owe them nothing." I looked around the room one more time. At my parents, who couldn't meet my eyes. At Brandon, who for once had nothing to say. At the house that had never really been theirs to give away. I could throw them out. I could make them feel what I felt that night, standing on the sidewalk with my suitcase, homeless and heartbroken. The thought was tempting. The revenge would be sweet. But as I stood there, I realized something. Revenge wouldn't heal me. It wouldn't give me back the years I lost trying to earn their love. It would just make me like them, small and petty and cruel. I took a deep breath. "You can stay," I said finally. My mother's face flooded with relief. "Oh, thank you, sweetheart. Thank you so much." I held up my hand. "I'm not finished." "You can stay, but things are going to change. This is my house now. My name. My rules. No more freeloading. No more taking advantage. If you want to live here, you'll pay rent. Market rate. And Brandon," I turned to my brother, "you and your girlfriend can find somewhere else to live. There's no room for you here anymore." Brandon's face went red. "That's not fair." "Fair?" I laughed, and it came out bitter. "You want to talk about fair? You threw me out so you could have my room. Now I'm telling you there's no room for you at all." "That seems pretty fair to me." Edward chuckled from the doorway. "Well said, Ashley." My father tried one more time. "Ashley, please. We're your family. You can't do this to us." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the strong father figure I had wanted him to be, but a weak man who had lived off his daughter's generosity and called it parenting. "Watch me," I said quietly. I turned and walked toward the door where Edward stood, waiting. As I passed him, he put a hand on my shoulder. "Proud of you, kid," he murmured. Outside, the morning sun was fully up, warming the October air. I stood on the front steps, looking out at the street, at the neighborhood I had grown up in. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Lena came running across the street, her face split into a huge grin. "Did you just do what I think you did?" she asked breathlessly. I nodded. "I took it back. All of it." She hugged me tight. "I'm so proud of you." Behind us, I heard the door close. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew my family was in there, finally understanding that they had pushed me too far, taken too much, assumed too often that I would always be there to use. Edward's driver brought the car around. "Ashley," Edward said, "why don't you come stay with me for a few days? Give them time to process. Give yourself time to think about what comes next." I considered it, then shook my head. "Thank you, but no. I'm going to stay with Lena. I need to figure out my next move on my own terms, without anyone's influence. Even yours." He smiled at that. A real smile full of respect. "You really are my granddaughter, stubborn and independent to the core." "I learned from the best," I replied. He climbed into his car, but before closing the door, he looked at me one more time. "The house is yours, Ashley. But more importantly, your life is yours." Don't let anyone take that from you again. Not even family. Especially not family. I watched his car drive away, then turned to Lena. Want to get breakfast? I asked. I'm suddenly very hungry. Best idea you've had all morning, she laughed. Come on, there's a great diner 2 blocks from here. My treat. As we walked down the sidewalk, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Real, genuine freedom. Not the kind that comes from running away, but the kind that comes from standing your ground and claiming what's yours. 2 days later, news of what happened had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Boston's close-knit communities loved a good story, and this one had everything: family drama, unexpected inheritance, poetic justice. I couldn't walk to the corner store without someone stopping me to say they always knew I deserved better, even though most of them had never said a word when my family treated me like their personal ATM. I was sitting in a coffee shop near the courthouse when Edward found me. He slid into the chair across from me and placed a newspaper on the table. Local woman reclaims family home, the headline read. I skimmed the article. It was surprisingly accurate, though it painted my parents in a kinder light than they deserved. You're famous, Edward said dryly. I grimaced. I didn't want to be famous. I just wanted to be free. Freedom often comes with attention, he replied. The question is what you do with it. I looked up at him. What do you mean? He leaned back in his chair. You have the house. You have the power. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to move back in? Sell it? Rent it out? I don't know yet, I admitted. Every time I think about that house, I feel angry and sad and tired all at once. That's normal, he said. But Ashley, here's what I've learned in my 70 years on this planet. Sometimes losing everything is how you figure out who you really are, and sometimes the best revenge isn't taking from others. It's building something so good for yourself that they can only watch from the sidelines. I thought about that for a long moment. You're right, I said finally. I don't want to spend my life in that house, watching them resent me. I don't want to be their landlord. I want to be free of all of it. Then be free, Edward said simply. Sell it. Use the money to start over somewhere new, or keep it and hire a property manager. But whatever you do, don't let that house become your prison just because it's finally yours. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching people walk by on the busy street outside. Then Edward spoke again, his voice softer. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you sooner. I saw what they were doing, how they treated you. I should have stepped in years ago. Why didn't you? I asked, not accusingly, just curious. Pride, he admitted. After I had my falling out with your mother, I told myself I wouldn't interfere in her family, that she had made her choices and had to live with them. But I forgot that you were part of that family too, and you deserved better than to be collateral damage in an old man's grudge. You're here now, I said. That's what matters. He smiled sadly. Better late than never, I suppose. A week passed. I had moved most of my things out of Lena's apartment and into a small rental in Cambridge, across the river. It was barely more than a studio, but it was mine. Clean slate, fresh start. Lena had helped me move, insisting on buying pizza and beer to celebrate even though we were both exhausted. On a Tuesday afternoon, I returned to my childhood home one final time. Not to stay, but to officially take ownership, to sign the papers that would make everything legal and binding. The lawyer met me there, a tall woman in her 40s named Margaret Sullivan. She had kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that I appreciated. The house was quiet when we arrived. My parents' car wasn't in the driveway. They had made themselves scarce, probably unable to face me after everything that had happened. Only Brandon was home, sitting on the front steps like he was guarding the fortress. He stood when he saw us approaching. Ashley, he said, and for the first time I could remember, he didn't sound cocky or dismissive. He sounded defeated. Can we talk? I glanced at Margaret. She nodded. I'll wait in the car. Take your time. Brandon and I stood facing each other on the sidewalk. He looked different. Thinner maybe, or just smaller somehow. The golden boy sheen had worn off, revealing someone ordinary underneath. I never thought it would come to this, he said quietly. I never thought you'd actually take the house. What did you think would happen? I asked. That I'd just let you all keep walking over me forever? Maybe, he admitted. You always did before, because I loved you, I said, and the past tense hung heavy between us. I loved all of you. I wanted to be part of this family so badly that I let you use me. But loving someone doesn't mean letting them destroy you. Brandon looked down at his shoes. Mom and Dad are talking about moving out, finding a smaller place they can afford. They're humiliated. Good, I said, and I meant it. Maybe humiliation will teach them something. And me? He asked. What about me? What about you, Brandon? What do you want me to say? That I forgive you? That we can go back to being siblings like none of this happened? He shrugged helplessly. I guess I just want to know if there's any way to fix this. I thought about it, really thought about it. There's always a way to fix things. I said finally, but it requires actually changing, not just saying you're sorry because you got caught. It requires acknowledging what you did wrong and working to be better. Are you willing to do that? He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. I think so. I want to try. Then try, I said. But not with me. Not yet. I need time and space to heal from all of this. Maybe someday we can rebuild something. But it won't be what it was. It can't be. I understand, he said, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, he actually did. I left him on the steps and went inside with Margaret. The house felt hollow, like it was holding its breath. We went through the paperwork methodically, signing page after page. Transfer of deed, assumption of ownership, liability waivers, tax documents. It was bureaucratic and boring and absolutely necessary. When we finished, Margaret handed me a thick envelope. Congratulations, she said. You're officially a homeowner. I laughed. I don't feel like a homeowner. I feel like I just escaped from prison. She smiled knowingly. Give it time. The feeling will catch up to the reality. After she left, I walked through the house alone. I went from room to room, touching walls, looking out windows, remembering. Here was the kitchen where I used to make breakfast before school. There was the living room where we used to watch movies on Friday nights. Up the stairs, my old bedroom, now stripped of anything that made it mine. I stood in the center of my former room and closed my eyes. Goodbye, I whispered. Not to the house, but to the version of myself who had lived here, who had believed that sacrifice and suffering were the price of love. When I opened my eyes, I felt lighter. I walked back downstairs and out the front door, locking it behind me. This house had been my past, but it didn't have to be my future. A month later, I listed the property for sale. My parents had quietly moved out to a rental apartment in Quincy. Brandon and his girlfriend had found a place in Somerville. None of them fought me on it. I think they finally understood that they had lost any claim to my generosity. The house sold quickly. It was a good property in a desirable neighborhood, and I had priced it fairly. The new owners were a young couple with a baby on the way. They stood in the living room during the final walkthrough, talking excitedly about paint colors and furniture arrangements, full of hope and dreams. I handed them the keys and wished them happiness. May this house be kinder to you than it was to me, I said. The husband looked confused, but the wife smiled gently. She understood, I think. With the money from the sale, I paid off the last of my student loans, invested in my consulting business, and put a down payment on a small condo in Cambridge. It was mine, truly mine, with no history attached to it. Clean walls, empty rooms, a blank canvas. Edward helped me move in, insisting on being there despite his age. As we carried boxes up the stairs, he paused to look at me. You did it, kid. You broke free. I did, I agreed, but I couldn't have done it without you. Yes, you could have, he said firmly. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe you would have done it differently. But you would have found your way. That's who you are. We set up furniture and hung pictures. Lena came over with wine and takeout, and the three of us sat on my new couch, eating Chinese food straight from the containers and talking about everything and nothing. This feels right, Lena said. Like you finally found where you belong. I looked around my tiny living room, at the mismatched furniture and the bare walls that still needed decoration. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that made it perfect. 6 months passed. My business grew. I hired 2 employees and signed contracts with several major clients. Money wasn't tight anymore. I could afford to relax, to enjoy life, to think about things beyond just surviving. I saw my family occasionally, by accident usually. Brandon and I had coffee once, a stilted, awkward hour where we talked about everything except the house. My mother called on my birthday, left a message I never returned. My father sent a card at Christmas with no note inside, just his signature. Edward and I had dinner every Sunday at his house in Beacon Hill. We talked about business, about life, about his regrets and my hopes. He told me stories about my grandmother, who had passed before I was born, and about what it meant to build something meaningful with your life. You remind me of her, he said one evening. She never let anyone tell her who she was supposed to be. She decided for herself and damn the consequences. I hope I'm half as brave as she was, I replied. You're braver, he said. She never had to fight her own family for the right to exist. In the spring, I got an unexpected message. It was from my mother. Just 3 words. Can we talk? I stared at the text for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to delete it, to block her number, to cut her out of my life completely. But another part, the part that still remembered being a little girl who just wanted her mother's approval, that part wanted to give her one more chance. I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a park near the harbor. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench overlooking the water. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile. Time and consequences had carved new lines into her face. I sat down beside her, leaving space between us. We both stared at the water for a while, neither knowing how to start. Finally, she spoke. I've been going to therapy, she said quietly, trying to understand why I did the things I did, why I pushed you away. And? I prompted. And I realized I was trying to relive my own childhood through Brandon, she said. I was the forgotten daughter too, you know. My parents always favored my brother. I thought if I could give Brandon everything I never had, it would heal something in me. But it didn't, I said. No, she agreed. It just hurt you. And now I've lost both of you. Brandon barely speaks to me anymore. He blames me for ruining everything. And you, she turned to look at me for the first time, you shouldn't speak to me at all. But here you are. I don't know why I'm here, I admitted. Maybe because I needed to see if you'd changed. If you actually understood what you did to me. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I understand now. Too late, but I understand. You were everything I should have valued, and I threw you away like you meant nothing. We sat in silence again. I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of letting go. I can't forget what happened, I said finally. And I don't know if I can ever fully forgive it. But I don't want to carry this anger forever either. So here's what I can offer. We can start over. Not as mother and daughter, not yet. But as two people who hurt each other and are trying to do better. She reached for my hand hesitantly. I don't deserve that, she whispered. No, I agreed. But I deserve peace. And holding on to hate doesn't give me that. We sat on that bench for another hour, talking carefully, testing the waters of a relationship that had been shattered and might never be whole again. It wasn't healing, it wasn't closure, but it was something. A first step on a very long road. As I drove home that evening, I thought about everything that had happened. How I had lost my home and found my strength. How I had been pushed out only to discover I had owned everything all along. How the worst night of my life had led to the best year. I thought about forgiveness and justice, about family and freedom. I thought about the girl who used to measure her worth by how much she could give, and the woman who had learned to take back what was hers. Edward called as I pulled into my parking space. Just checking in, he said. How'd it go? Complicated, I replied. But okay, better than I expected. Good, he said. Remember, Ashley, healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about deciding what power those memories have over your future. I know, I said. And I'm done letting them have any power at all. A year after that terrible night when I was thrown out of my childhood home, I stood in the doorway of my condo and looked around at the life I had built. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, still moments when I questioned my choices, still scars that ached. But it was mine. Lena was in the kitchen making dinner, loudly singing off key to a radio. Edward was coming over soon, bringing wine and stories. I had a business I was proud of, a home I loved, and people in my life who saw me, really saw me. My phone buzzed. A text from Brandon. Congrats on the new contract I saw you post about. You're killing it. I smiled and typed back. Thanks. How's life? Getting better. Slow but better. It wasn't much, but it was honest. And that was more than we'd had in years. I walked to the window and looked out at the city spread before me. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and rose. Somewhere out there was the house I used to live in, with the family I used to break myself trying to please. They were living their lives, and I was living mine. Separate, different, better. I used to think that belonging meant being chosen, that love meant sacrifice, that family meant enduring whatever they dealt out because blood was supposed to be thicker than pain. Now I knew better. Belonging meant choosing yourself. Love meant boundaries. Family meant the people who earned the right to be in your life, not the ones who assumed they could stay no matter how they treated you. The doorbell rang. Edward had arrived early, his arms full of groceries. Let me help you cook, he declared, pushing past me into the kitchen where he proceeded to argue with Lena about proper seasoning techniques. I stood in my doorway and laughed, really laughed, the sound bright and free. This was my family now, not perfect but chosen, not bound by obligation but by love. And that, I realized, was worth more than any house could ever be. Sometimes, you have to lose everything to find out what you were never meant to carry in the first place. Sometimes the people who push you out do you the greatest favor of your life, even if they never meant to. I closed the door and joined my family in the kitchen, ready to make dinner, ready to make memories, ready to make a life that was truly, finally, mine. The weight I had carried for 25 years was gone. In its place was something lighter, stronger, brighter. It was freedom. It was peace. It was the knowledge that I had survived the worst thing I could imagine and come out the other side not broken, but whole. And when I looked in the mirror now, I didn't see the forgotten daughter, the sacrificial sister, the overlooked child. I saw Ashley Bennett, survivor, business owner, woman who knew her worth. I saw someone who had been pushed out of her home only to discover she had the power to take it back, someone who had been told she didn't belong only to learn she had owned everything all along. Most importantly, I saw someone who had finally learned the most crucial lesson of all, that the only person whose acceptance I truly needed was my own. And I had that. At last, I had that. The house I grew up in was gone, sold to strangers who would fill it with their own memories. The family I thought I needed had scattered, each of us finding our own path forward. The girl who would do anything for love had grown into a woman who knew that the right kind of love never requires you to destroy yourself. I had lost everything and gained the world. I had been pushed out and walked back in stronger. I had been told I was nothing and learned I was everything. This was my story. The story of how I was broken down and built myself back up. The story of how I lost my home and found myself. The story of how the worst thing that ever happened to me became the best thing that ever could have happened. And as I sat down to dinner with the people who had earned their place at my table, I realized something profound. The revenge I had once craved wasn't in taking from others. It was in refusing to let what they took from me define who I became. They had pushed me out, but I had walked back in. And I had walked right through to the other side, to a life they could never touch, never taint, never take away. That was my victory. That was my freedom. That was my happy ending, earned, not given, fought for, not fallen into, and it was more than enough.